In the year 1545, a man named Diego Gualpa was herding llamas on a freezing mountain plateau in what is today Bolivia. He stumbled, grabbed a shrub to stop himself falling, pulled it from the ground, and found pure silver ore clinging to its roots. He had discovered Cerro Rico, Rich Hill, the mountain that would, over the next 2 centuries, produce 60% of the world's silver supply, kill 8 million people in its mines, and, in a connection that nobody in Delhi ever fully understood, fund the greatest empire in Asia. The Mughal Empire never sent a single soldier to Bolivia. No Mughal emperor ever met a Bolivian miner. No Mughal administrator ever counted African slaves in a South American mine. Yet the prosperity of the world's richest empire was directly connected to all three. This is the story of that connection, and of how a Portuguese sailor with 3 small ships ended it. We established in an earlier video that the Mughal Empire imported money. Around 80% of everything it received from the outside world was not goods but bullion, silver and gold coins and bars. The empire exported cotton, silk, indigo and textiles, and the world paid in precious metal. Between the 1580s and 1680s, Mughal mints absorbed silver worth approximately 240 million rupees. Only Ming China imported more silver than Mughal India during this entire period. But where was all this silver coming from? The answer begins in a mountain in Bolivia, and passes through some of history's greatest crimes before arriving in Delhi. Diego Gualpa's discovery in 1545 triggered the largest silver rush in human history. Within 3 decades, the mountain city of Potosi had grown from nothing to a population of over 200,000 people, larger than London or Paris at that time. The Habsburg Emperor Charles V called Potosi the treasury of the world. He was not exaggerating. At its peak in the 1590s, Potosi alone was producing approximately 300 tons of silver annually, representing 60% of everything the world mined. Between 1500 and 1800, Latin America produced approximately 150,000 tons of silver, 80% of global production across 3 centuries. The machinery running this operation was human suffering on an industrial scale. The Spanish colonial administration used a forced labor system called the Mita, an adaptation of older Andean traditions twisted into something far more brutal. Indigenous men were drafted from their villages, marched to the mountain, and sent underground in shifts lasting the entire week. They breathed mercury vapor used in the silver refining process. They worked in tunnels so narrow they could not stand upright. They carried ore sacks weighing over 30 kilograms up ladders cut into shafts hundreds of meters deep. When indigenous labor was depleted by death and disease, smallpox, typhus and mercury poisoning killed communities faster than they could be replaced, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans. Over 100,000 African slaves were shipped to Mexico alone between 1521 and 1650 to supplement the dying indigenous workforce. Historians estimate that over the full period of Potosi's operation, approximately 8 million people died in and around the mountain's mines. The Spanish writer, Cervantes, updated an old phrase to capture the scale of wealth involved. Instead of worth a Peru, he wrote worth a Potosi. It became a common expression meaning something of unimaginable value. 8 million people died in the mountain. The silver they extracted with their lives traveled across 2 oceans and became the coins that lined the Mughal treasury. The richest empire in history was built, in part, on deaths that happened on the other side of the world. Understanding how Bolivian silver reached Delhi requires following one of history's most remarkable supply chains. The silver was refined at Potosi using mercury from the Huancavelica mines in Peru. It was then transported on the backs of llamas down from the mountain, at an altitude of 4,800 meters, too high for horses, to the river port of Buenos Aires, named after the silver it carried on its waters, the word plata meaning silver in Spanish. From there it crossed the Atlantic to Spain. In Spain, some silver was minted into the famous piece of 8, the Spanish dollar, the world's first truly global currency. Spanish silver coins began circulating across the Ottoman Empire, Persia and Mughal India by 1580. European merchants, Portuguese, Dutch and British, loaded these coins onto ships heading east. They used them to buy Indian cotton, silk and indigo because Indian goods were superior and in high global demand. The coins arrived at Surat and Bengal, were melted down in Mughal mints, and re-stamped as Mughal rupees. Bolivian silver, extracted by enslaved labor, had become the monetary foundation of the world's richest Asian empire. A second route brought silver from Japan. The Dutch East India Company bought Japanese silver, used it to purchase Indian textiles, and the silver again ended up in Mughal mints. The Mughals sat at the receiving end of global silver flows from both the Americas and Asia simultaneously. For roughly a century, from the 1550s to the 1650s, they were the final destination of more silver than any other state on earth except China. But while all this silver was flowing east, something had already happened that would, very slowly, then very suddenly, reverse the entire direction of global economic power. It had happened 50 years before Cerro Rico was discovered. It happened on the 20th of May 1498, when a Portuguese sailor named Vasco da Gama anchored off the coast of Calicut on India's southwestern shore. Da Gama had sailed from Lisbon in July 1497, rounded the southern tip of Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean with the help of a Gujarati pilot named Abdul Majid, and arrived in India with 3 small ships. He had brought almost nothing of value to trade. Indian merchants at Calicut were not impressed by his goods and were suspicious of his intentions. Half his crew died of scurvy on the return voyage. But when he arrived back in Lisbon in 1499, he was received as a hero. He had found something worth more than any cargo, a direct sea route from Europe to Asia that bypassed the entire Middle Eastern trade network. Before 1498, every ship carrying goods between Europe and Asia had to pass through routes controlled by Arab, Persian and Ottoman middlemen, through the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, overland through the Ottoman Empire. These middlemen charged at every step. Indian goods arrived in Europe expensive because they had changed hands so many times on the journey. The Mughals and their predecessors benefited enormously from being the origin point of this system. After 1498, Europeans could sail directly to India. No middlemen, no tolls, no Ottoman gatekeepers. The Portuguese arrived first, establishing trading posts at Calicut, Cochin and Goa. The Dutch followed, forming their East India Company in 1602. The British formed theirs in 1600. Within a century of Da Gama's first voyage, the Indian Ocean, which had been an Arab and Indian commercial space for 1,000 years, had become a European-controlled highway. For a generation, European arrival in India actually increased silver inflows into the Mughal Empire. More buyers coming directly to Indian ports meant more demand, more competition, more silver paid for Indian goods. But beneath the surface of this apparently beneficial arrangement, something fundamental was shifting. Europeans were not simply buying Indian goods. They were building the infrastructure of control. They were charting every coastline, mapping every trade wind, establishing fortified ports, and building war fleets. The Mughals, with their magnificent land army and their river fleet, had nothing capable of challenging European warships at sea. The empire that produced the goods the whole world wanted had no navy to protect the routes through which those goods traveled. It was selling its products to customers who could, at any moment they chose, stop allowing those products to reach their destination. That moment came gradually, then all at once. Potosi's silver production peaked in the 1590s and began its long decline as the richest ore veins were exhausted. The silver flowing into Mughal mints began reducing. Then European attitudes toward Indian goods shifted. British domestic wool and silk industries lobbied Parliament to protect themselves from Indian competition. The result was the Calico Acts of 1690 and 1720, which banned Indian cotton cloth from the British market entirely. Not outcompeted. Banned. The most sophisticated textile industry on earth was legally excluded from its largest customer by legislation designed to protect inferior British products. Simultaneously, the European trading companies began transforming their role in India. They were no longer simply buyers of Indian goods who paid in silver. They were becoming revenue collectors, extracting taxes from Indian territories and using that revenue to buy Indian goods, meaning silver no longer needed to flow into India at all. The trade that had made India rich had been turned into a mechanism for making India poor. Stand back from the complete story and the circuit becomes visible in all its brutal clarity. Enslaved Africans and indigenous Americans were forced to mine silver in Bolivia and Mexico. That silver crossed the Atlantic, funded European commerce, and flowed into Mughal India as payment for textiles and spices. The Mughal Empire, unknowingly sitting at the end of this circuit, accumulated the world's greatest treasury, built on the suffering of people it never knew existed, in continents it had never visited, dying in mines it had never heard of. Then Vasco da Gama's 1498 route allowed Europeans to control the circuit entirely. Portuguese, Dutch and British companies gradually took command of the sea lanes. The Calico Acts closed European markets to Indian goods. Potosi's mines declined. The silver stopped flowing. And the companies that had come to buy Indian goods began instead to collect Indian revenue, completing the reversal of a circuit that had once carried wealth eastward and redirecting it permanently west. India's share of world GDP stood at approximately 25% in 1700. By 1947, when British rule ended, it had fallen to 4%. That is not a coincidence of history. That is the measurable consequence of a circuit that was built on slavery, operated for 2 centuries, and then reversed, leaving the empire that had benefited from it not just poor, but structurally unable to understand or resist what had happened to it. The Mughals did not lose their wealth because they were weak. They lost it because they were rich in a world where others had learned to control the routes through which wealth traveled, and they had never thought to protect those routes themselves.